Today, we are having Dr. Jonathan Clark, and he has quite a very interesting background. He is currently the Senior Research Scientist at the Florida Institute for Human-Machine Cognition and an Adjunct Associate Professor of Neurology and Space Medicine at Baylor College of Medicine. Dr. Clark served for 26 years as an active duty member of the United States Navy. He is qualified as a Naval Flight Officer, a Naval Flight Surgeon, Navy Diver, and Special Forces military freefall parachutist, and even flew combat missions in Operation Desert Storm with the Marine Corps. He worked at NASA for 8 years as a space shuttle crew surgeon, and he now consults with a number of different space companies and other groups. So without any further ado, Dr.
It's certainly a privilege and honor to be here at Rancho Mirage in this beautiful library and this observatory. And again, thanks for the foundation support. And I've been told there's no food in the audience for people to throw at me. So, the original talk I was going to say was, why space, why now? How many here would want to go to space if they could? Excellent. And I do talks all over the place. A lot of them I do on crew survival, and I do one on threats. And so you go through and see all the things that can kill you in space. And, hopefully that number won't change afterwards. And this will hopefully be an informative. I try to cut out most of the text slides and just show pictures about some of the things that are ongoing in the near future and far future. So I worked for a number of different commercial space companies since I left NASA. Excalibur Almaz took the Russian Almaz military space program and commercialized it, and then Dennis Tito set up a Inspiration Mars Foundation. And I'll talk a little bit about some of my work in crew escape and survival, and then a number of other commercial space companies that I still work with. So I was a naval officer at the time, and I would never have gotten to NASA were it not for my wife who was there. And she actually pulled me out of my job kicking and screaming, and I ended up going over there and saying, hey, shoot, I get to fly another kind of aircraft. I'm all for that. That was a picture of me with a T-38. That was my wife, Laurel, and our son. My job was to work in mission control and also the launch control center in the Cape. And this was a mission that was near and dear to me because it was, I grew up in post-war West Germany and saw the carnage there, and it really touched me. And this mission was really interesting because it was a Japanese, German, and U.S. mission. And I thought, wow, wouldn't it have been different if we took all those forces and instead of, using them to fight and kill each other, we would go and do something noble like space. And that's the unifying point I try to take home here, is that space is for everybody. And hopefully it will be something that helps unite our country and the world in a common cause. Laurel was assigned to the STS-107 mission, which was a science mission. At the time, most of the missions were to space station to assembly, and hers was always getting delayed and finally launched in January of 2003. Unfortunately, 16 days later, it broke apart because of damage sustained to its wing during the ascent phase. I actually worked this mission, and I'd heard about some of the things going on there, and I in some way hold myself responsible, as do many others. I was in a very weird position at NASA, basically put into the investigation of the aftermath, and as a part of that, I studied crew escape and survival, and I had a background in much of that. And it was always challenging because my son had kept saying, well, why didn't they just bail out? And ironically, when this program ended in 2008, I got asked to be a part of the team that went to do high-altitude parachuting from the stratosphere. This is a picture of us out in Florida in the vertical assembly building where the shuttle debris was, and we were putting things together and trying to understand what happened that had never been done before. And there were several reports, very eloquent reports written about that. We learned a tremendous amount in the aftermath of it. And part of my goal after I left NASA was to make sure that as many of those lessons as possible could be passed on to the commercial sector. So 2009, I joined the Red Bull Stratus project, which was a very challenging effort. I was the medical director because I had a high altitude parachuting experience and a lot of experience with spacesuit activities. And 3 years later, we sent a human for the first time through this sound barrier without any kind of protection like would normally be done in a vehicle. And ironically, that was on the 65th anniversary of Chuck Yeager's flight in 1947 to the day. Not that that was intended, but the advances that were taken out of the suit actually were fed back to NASA, and now they have the thing called the Modified Advanced Crew Escape Suit. As soon as this program ended, I followed on with a second program, a different spacesuit and a different concept. This was not funded by anybody but the originator of it, Alan Eustace, who was a Google executive at the time, and he said, I want to develop a scuba suit for the stratosphere. And 2 years and 10 days later, he beat Felix's record. He got to almost 136,000 feet, and both of them broke the speed of sound by a significant amount. And both those programs still to this day are advancing survivability in a number of arenas. Along the way, as I had the opportunity, I took every student and resident physician that I had that I was working with and brought them in on the project. Many of them went to NASA and are still doing great things. And I also took them to the Stratex mission. Anil Menon, he's the flight surgeon for SpaceX, and Eric Antonsen, he works for NASA. So the cool thing is, all these folks, Charmy Watkins, who was on both programs, she works for NASA as well. So what I do now, my role, is to touch the future, to pass the inspiration on to the next generation, because they have a lot of challenges ahead, and as the technology's advanced, we are going to see tremendous and wonderful things. And so what I try to do is also encourage folks in their early career phase to take that charge. And I still do a lot of work with students, and these are actual real spacesuits that have been in space before, and I do training sessions with them. And this is a couple of other students in different suits that I've also been involved with. Well, how many of you were here in the 60s? All of us, yeah, me too. And at the time, I was always inspired by the space program, even though I was a military brat living all over the world. But this was the space program of the 60s. It was heavily fortified by military experience. All of the first astronauts, even in the Apollo era, had been trained originally as military test pilots. And the X-15 I show here, that actually went to space. And that, I think there were 4 or 5 of the pilots that qualified for astronaut wings, because it could reach the barrier of space, which the Air Force considers as 50 miles. But we were using military assets to go to space in air-launched winged reentry vehicles, and also repurposed Titan II intercontinental ballistic missile with a 2-man capsule at the top. So I was doing a talk, and I said, well, what are we doing now? Here's what we're doing now. It's not necessarily done by the military, but it's still the same kind of concepts. Air-launched, winged reentry vehicles. This is Spaceship 2, this is Spaceship 1. Spaceship 1's qualified 3 astronauts for pilot wings, and Spaceship 2, just less than a month ago, qualified 2 of their pilots as astronauts, but one had already flown the space shuttle, so he's got both civilian and military astronaut wings. And instead of intercontinental ballistic missiles, these are built by very forward-thinking entrepreneurs This is the Falcon 9 flown by SpaceX, which is based out of Hawthorne, California, and is visionary led by Elon Musk. And then this is the Blue Origin New Shepard, which is their company's based in Kent, Washington, and they are under the visionary of Jeff Bezos. Both of them have taken financial resources that they've developed in the commercial sector and put them forward into their space programs. So if this was a study that was done in 2011 about what would be the perfect dream, now I'm not sure how many people have the money to spend some of this, but it's not terribly expensive to go, if you're super rich, to spend a couple $100,000 and go to fly on the Virgin Galactic, which I'll talk a little bit about later. And it's certainly within the realm of, of a round the world, 7 wonders of the world trip, or, a week on the Riviera, something like that. But I'll get into it, that there are others that have gone to space as spaceflight participants or space tourists, and they've paid a lot more than a couple $100,000. But the reason that we would go and do this is because there's this innate curiosity, and now we have adventure tourism and ecotourism, and I've traveled all over the world to different places, and I still live a pretty active lifestyle. And so if I could do it, and I volunteered with all the companies I work for, if they need a test dummy, I'm more than happy to fill that role. But we have this innate desire to go to the next hilltop and see what's out there. So perhaps some of you in the audience will even make that venture. The ultimate goal of these companies now is to drive the cost down to something that would be well below what it is now, which is in the hundreds of thousands of dollars for suborbital flights, or several tens of millions of dollars, which is currently only done on the Russian side of using their Soyuz launch system. But really what I'll talk about is that there's a huge economic potential that's there, and I'll just touch on a few of those things. These are the 7 people who've flown in space as space tourists under the Space Adventures contract with the Russian Space Agency, and all of them except for Guy Liberté were high-tech folks who, in fact, some of them took their science projects with them to the space station. Dennis Tito, who also ran Inspiration Mars, and I've had the opportunity to work for, was the first one, and he really broke a lot of barriers. And then since his flight in 2001, there's been about every year or so later another astronaut flown. And Charles Simoni liked it so much he did it twice. Now the cost for the tickets early on was about $25 million, and later on was in the $40 million. And SpaceX has just signed a Japanese billionaire to send artists up to space on a lunar flyby mission, like Apollo 8 was, and that price is in the over $100 million. So imagine that there are people with high-value asset wealth who will spend phenomenal sums to do this incredible thing. In 2004, Scale Composites, which was a company founded by Burt Rutan, built Spaceship One and competed in the Ansari X Prize that had to fly the equivalent of 3 people into space and have a turnaround period of a couple of weeks. And they only flew a pilot and the sandbag equivalent of 2 passengers. And 2 of their pilots, Mike Melville and Brian Binney, qualified for astronaut wings. And you all may have heard about that. They flew out of California, out of Mojave, and that's made Mojave a famous place. Here's Spaceship One. It's a tiny little thing, maybe the size of a small, I would say a real small SUV, carried to a 50,000 foot altitude where you spend a lot of energy if you were using a rocket to get up there. And this thing was a pretty well-designed and functional system. They want to scale it up and take tourists now. So what they've done now is they've designed Spaceship Two, Also, captive carry air launch has a bigger mothership. This is White Knight 2, and it has 4 engines instead of 2, and it carries 2 pilots and 6 passengers in the rear compartments. And this would be like, I would say, a camper van. Pretty nice, but still pretty small. And you know, its founder, Richard Branson, is a visionary guy who's had the Virgin Group and made a lot of money in a lot of different endeavors. And he had vowed that he would fly, Virgin Galactic would fly before the end of 2018, and sure enough, he did that. I think it was 13 December, he flew his 2 pilots. So he's kept that promise, and he says he wants to be the first one to go when they start flying, you know, passengers, and also take his family. So he trusts it well enough to put his life on the line for the first flight with spaceflight participants. Here you see him out. This is actually over the high desert of Mojave near Edwards Air Force Base. They've had one mishap, unfortunately, in 2014, but it was not a Virgin Galactic mishap. It was a Scale Composites spaceship company mishap, and they had an unfortunate event where the vehicle broke apart after going through the speed of sound. But just you know, not even a month ago, the 2 pilots, Mark Stuckey and C.J. Sturkow, flew to above 50 miles, so they got qualified as astronauts based on that criteria of what the Air Force says is space. There's a battle between the Federation Aeronautic International and the U.S. on what constitutes space. And if you have any physics background, I can give you some more detail on that. This was the shot from the back of the cameras of the altitude record back in just a few weeks ago. I always like to point this out because, you know, you can see the curvature of the Earth even from 100,000 feet. And it's equivalent to if you had a basketball, the atmosphere is 4 sheets of paper. And you can actually see it in layers. And I think earlier on they were showing some videos that were shot from the space station, and you can see a very distinct atmosphere that's held there by the gravity of the Earth. And it actually, you know, it's that very bottom layer that only maybe a couple tens of thousands of feet that we can actually survive in without oxygen. And you can see people that go to Everest, which is almost 30,000 feet if they acclimate over time. But the reason you go and do something like this is not just to get the microgravity experience or weightlessness, it's to see the view and to see the planet. Virgin Galactic has had over 700 people sign up, and some of the earlier ones who were in their 70s when they signed up or 80s are now in their 90s, and so they're still hanging in there hoping that they can go. And I think they will. I think there's every likelihood that they'll be flying passengers, I would say, within the next couple of years. But there's a risk averseness that it didn't manifest itself in the 60s and 70s when they were flying, you know, Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo. Those were really incredibly risky missions with a lot less flight tests and a lot less safety features. But now, because of the concern about litigation and whatnot, the companies really want to make sure they're doing the right thing. So the fact that this stuff is taking longer than anticipated is no doubt partly due to the sense of trying to make sure it's absolutely as safe as possible. But nonetheless, I would go. Blue Origin out of Washington has a test stand in McGregor, Texas, and this capsule, the new Shepard, has launched and been refurbished and used 5 times. A big part of cutting costs is to reuse and recycle things. And traditionally, all the rockets were expendable, except for the space shuttle. And that had, certain limitations, and it was very, very quick. It was quite lengthy an amount of time to refurbish it and get it back flying again. So the idea is that eventually this will be airline style, where, the vehicle comes back down, it's refueled and refurbished and launched again. And the Ansari X Prize, they had to do it within 2 weeks. So it's been demonstrated. That's not necessarily airline style, except if you're flying a really bad airline. But it's a lot better than it used to be. And the fact that there's so much reusability now is really cutting costs immensely. This is a shot of their capsule coming down, and the capsule has huge windows. I mean, they're really, really, really big. And so they've already demonstrated the safety of the launch system and the safety of the parachute, descent system. And they've even done an abort test. Here's the new Shepard coming back down. So it basically lands where it took off from. It's only doing a suborbital flight, maybe 4 minutes of microgravity, and then coming back down, and then, like I said, this thing's been reused 5 times. Here's a test of the abort system. An abort system is something that if you have a breakup or some kind of misadventure during launch, like the vehicle breaks apart, then the escape capsule that contains the crew, it can be jettisoned without adverse effects. And this was an actual test where both the capsule was jettisoned with its escape motor, and also the launch system, both were recovered. Here's a picture that shows some of the spaceports that are around. There's long been launches out of Vandenberg in Lompoc, and they have to launch north-south in polar orbits, because if they launched out this way, if the vehicle in the first stage broke apart, it might hit some populated area. That's why a lot of the launch sites are on the East Coast, because you're launching out over the Atlantic. And then you've got a lot of the test facilities. There's actually, Elon Musk is also building one in the tip of Texas down here. But we have quite a few in California, and Edwards is where the space shuttle landed quite a few times, and then Mojave was where the first commercial astronauts were awarded their wings. And here's just 2 pictures of there's 2 launch complexes that launch commercial out of Vandenberg, and then the Mojave, it's called Mojave Air and Spaceport. And they're very proud of their legacy from Spaceship One. Any of you heard of Stratolaunch? It's a monster big aircraft. This is an artist rendition. The idea is, instead of using a rocket to haul up the first stage where you're going through the thick part of the atmosphere, you fly an aircraft up and you get out of that thick atmosphere, and then you launch your second stage essentially as a payload, as are shown here. And this is was used for the X-15, and it's what was used for Spaceship One and Spaceship Two. And so they have this. Look at the size of that thing. I mean, it is a monster. It's also built by Scale Composites, and the idea is that because this is reusable, this thing could launch spacecraft several times a day. So essentially, it's a first stage that does operate like an airline. And it just, on the 9th of January, not even a week ago, it did its high-speed taxi test on Mojave, and it's just barely almost lifting off. So they're very close to doing, an actual flight with this behemoth that will be one of the largest air launch systems. There's also Virgin Orbit has one, and so does Orbital ATK, which uses a modified DC-10. Virgin Launch uses a 747 that used to be in the Virgin Galactic fleet. Where would you go? You can go to space and do 5 minutes, or you can go up there and maybe have a honeymoon or one roaring bachelor party. So Bob Bigelow is a hotelier in Las Vegas, and he decided that he was going to make a huge investment in this. And using a concept that actually was NASA developed, which was inflatable spacecraft. And you kind of look at that and go, yeah, I don't know about that. You know, like, would you rather be in a rigid vessel or an inflatable one? But they use Kevlar, and these things are as strong as any aluminum or metal spacecraft. And sure enough, NASA got one, and at first they were just going to have it up there for a year, and they decided they liked it so much they're keeping it. And there's the Bigelow expandable module right here on the space station Destiny, I think, is the module it's attached to. There's the cupola that looks at the Earth. And some of those videos that you saw earlier before the show started were filmed with cameras from that. But this thing is, the concept is not theoretical, it's proven and habitable even as we speak. And sure enough, the idea is that there would be essentially a space hotel, and that there would be spacecraft that could go to that. And Boeing has partnered with Bigelow to be the space. You know, they're gonna do the just like they fly their Dreamliners, they're gonna fly the Starliner to this hotel. The cool thing is now that there's partnership, like there's always been, but now there's a very robust partnership between government and industry, and academia for that matter. And so companies are going, well, NASA needs a way to get people to and from the space station rather than being dependent on the Soyuz, which is Russian. And the last Soyuz, actually the one just before the last one, if you recall, broke apart during ascent. And so that thing was grounded for quite a few months, and the vehicle, both crews survived, but because they were dependent on only one way to get to space station, that really hurts them. So they've had a long appreciation for the need to have a partnership with the commercial space industry, and the two main contenders to carry crew to and from the space station are Boeing, and there's the Starliner, and then SpaceX Crew Dragon. And here you see the artist rendition of them docking to the ISS, but those aren't going to just be for government NASA purposes. There's also the Starliner going to the Bigelow Hotel in space when it finally gets up there. So we're seeing the best of both worlds, where some of the early development work can be done in support of government programs, but in the long term it's going to be about fully commercial operations. And I'm sure that the view alone is worth it. No camera, from talking to people who've flown in space and taken pictures, no camera can adequately capture the grandeur of space. And it's going up there and actually being there that gives that perspective. And trust me, I would do it in a heartbeat. Here's a cool shot. This is a time-lapse photo of a launch and a landing of a Falcon 9. The Falcon 9 first stage is entirely reusable, and so this was basically a time-lapse photo that showed the launch of one of the cargo resupply missions to the space station, and then the booster coming back down and landing, not just on a drone ship, but this is actually landing back on Cape Canaveral Air Force Station. Right now, the only way you can get anything back from space is either on the Soyuz, which has a very limited volume, or the Dragon capsule. And this thing lands right off the coast of California here. And they'll go out and pull these things out, and they can bring back 3 metric tons, which is essentially 3,000 kilograms of supplies and equipment and test material back down. And so very soon, when they fly the Crew Dragon, they'll be able to bring the crew back down, and I'll show you a little bit about some of the ideas there. Now, I'm sure you all have heard about these. This is called an autonomous spaceport drone ship, and Elon Musk has a favorite book that he takes characters from, or sayings, and this was one of the drone ships is, please read the instructions, and the other is, of course, I still love you. and then he's building a third one to replace, so he'll have 2 in Florida and 1 off the California coast. But they had some real hiccups coming back early on. In fact, one of the first ones that came back down, the sea state was incredible, and if you were on it, you would be sick as a dog, and you just knew that wasn't going to turn out pretty. And sure enough, you know, it lands, and then it toppled over, and you know, actually did a lot of damage to the first drone ship, which has since been retired. But these things now are coming back with such regularity. This is one that has flown in space before, been refurbished, took a resupply capsule up to the space station, and then came back down and landed. And right now, the problem is at SpaceX, they have so many of these, they don't even know what to do with them all because they can't refurbish them fast enough. Well, Elon Musk, and as is Jeff Bezos, are unbelievable dreamers. But what their dreams are is they're seeing the future. And this was a mission that happened as a demonstration flight using the Apollo Launch Complex 39A that's been repurposed now so that it supports SpaceX launches. And what this is the big, you know, you can read BFR, you know, big friggin' rocket or big whatever rocket, and it is huge. It's 3 Falcon 9s with a second stage. And amazingly, he couldn't bring all 3 of the drone, all 3 of the first stages back because he didn't have enough control centers to do that. But he brought 2 back, and they landed almost at the exact same time. And then to make, you know, a real statement is, well, I got to take a payload up. His first payload when he was launching the Falcon 9 capsule, Dragon capsule, was, anybody know what it was? It's a big wheel of cheese. Yeah, it was funny. It's funny as I'll get out because they all ate that. But this is one of his roadsters, a beautiful roadster, and that's the SpaceX suit, which they've developed. And I was actually a part of the test team that was the first human vacuum chamber exposure, you know, doing the monitoring for that. And this thing, if you go to this website, you can see you can see this video. That's a real picture. That's not an artist's rendition. He had a little boom out here, and he had a real-time video, and you're watching the Earth in the background. And that thing's going out to space because it was on the second stage, so it's going to keep on going somewhere, unless Jeff Bezos decides to go back and bring it back home and just to claim bragging rights to say, hey, you know, I got your Tesla. So he's now taken. He loves to recycle and reuse stuff, and sure enough. So this is the capsule recovery, or when they're flying crew back, this is the crew recovery ship. And the capsule lands in water. They had originally planned on it landing doing propulsive landing on a platform, but they decided that NASA just doesn't like that idea yet. But propulsive landing, as I'll get to in a minute, is a very important part of the next future transportation system. But this is the Go Searcher. This is their crew recovery ship, and here's a demonstration of them basically taking, you know, doing a dress rehearsal of you know, say an injured crew member on a gurney, landing a helicopter and then flying it back to the mainland. And then again, he doesn't like to waste anything. This is a fairing. When they launch these huge satellites into space, they have to cover them for the lower part of the atmosphere against the aerodynamic forces. And so this is an aerodynamic shroud that covers the payload. Could be a government satellite or a communications satellite. And Elon Musk goes, well, shoot, I don't want to waste that. So first thing he did was he put a parachute on it and landed it in the water. And now it could get some saltwater corrosion. So now his new thing is another drone recovery ship. And that's for real. That's a real ship. And it's up in Port of Los Angeles. And they're going out there and trying to catch that thing before it lands in the water. So the point I try to make is that there's a lot of really cool stuff going on. And, you know, if you can dream it, you can do it. And by golly, they are doing it. Well, when I was part of these balloon programs, somebody had the audacity to think, hey, you know, maybe there's a market here. And so this is a company I do consulting for. Worldview Enterprises was the balloon company that did the second jump of Alan Eustace. And now they have Spaceport Tucson, and they actually launch balloons. And this is a cover of Popular Science a couple years ago, and that's their system right there. Why would you do that? I don't have this slide in here, but the difference in the curvature of the Earth at 40 kilometers, where a balloon mission could go, and 100 kilometers, where you get the quote definition of space, is almost identical. The curvature is almost the same. The big difference is that you can, any of you have done balloon flights? You get to drink. You know, astronauts flying on Virgin Galactic and, you know, Blue Origin, they're probably not going to get to drink, but these guys, you can drink all the way up, and grandma can go in a wheelchair. And you have a long loiter time. You get up, you climb at about 1,000 feet per minute, and you say you're going to 100,000 feet. Well, that's an hour and a half to get up there, and then you could spend a little time. And they've got a plan to do this over, you know, the Lake Powell and the Kodachrome area of Utah, and it's beautiful. And actually, because you're a little closer to Earth, you can see a lot more, and it's a real slow descent back down under a parachute, which is this parafoil, and they've actually deployed these things at over 100,000 feet. So this is totally a game changer. A new industry is formed. There's another company called Zero to Infinity in Barcelona that's doing the same kind of flight test as Worldview is out in Tucson. And there's a company in China as well. Of course, they're waiting to learn what they can from us first. Not too far distant future. See, Richard Branson, what does he do? He has airlines flying all over the world. So why wouldn't you kind of, like you're building a vehicle that can go up and launch, you know, to the edge of space? If you get up to a high enough altitude, you basically skip on the upper atmosphere. And hypersonic test vehicles that NASA and the Air Force are flying are already doing that. And so right now, there's a company in the UK called Skylon who's building a reaction, it's called Reaction Limited. They're building an engine, a hybrid engine that could take off and also fly in a hypersonic mode. What's the advantage of that? Any of you got to ever fly the Concorde? It might cut your time in half. So instead of 8 hours to Europe, it's 4 hours. This is 90 minutes anywhere in the world. You know? I mean, and if any of you want any of the technical material on this, I could show it to you. So they've already got the airline routes. Now, soon, you know, the Singapore or the Sydney to London flight, you know, which is like 18, 20 hours. Oh my God. I mean, that's just hell if you're in economy. You know? I mean, shoot, this is a 90-minute. I don't even have to go to the bathroom for 90 minutes. That's a really good deal. So this is something that could really happen. And this is going to be another game changer. So this is the kind of thing that people that are dreaming stuff are doing stuff. And when this finally does happen, wow. Not only that, but say you need a life-threatening, you know, vaccine for something somewhere in the world. You can get it there within a couple of hours. So there's a lot of things that are, you know who's interested in this? I found this out for the high-performance, you know, F1 racing guys. They don't have every part there when they go all over the world to race, but if they're somewhere and they have one part that they don't have, they will spend any amount of money to get it to that race. So they might be the first users of that because they literally, you know, it's an open pocket. And there are aircraft, like there's a company that's bought the old F-104 Starfighter, a two-seat version, and they're looking at shorter distance point to point. So suborbital point to point is a huge potential market as well. Now, this just came out 2 days ago from Elon Musk on his Twitter feed, and he said that's real. And I said, that can't be real. It just doesn't look real. It looks like one of those things that I read in the 50s in comic books. It's a test vehicle, and it's out in Texas, and that's the guy in the suit, and it's all wrinkly because all this is not going to go to Mars or go into the upper atmosphere. It's just going to do up and down flights to test the system. But then I saw somebody else who was out there, and she took this picture, and I go, okay, maybe that is real, because that's the test. It's the landing test vehicle that's already built, and it's already out there, and they're already planning on doing those hopper tests where they take off and land and practice that thing. But literally, this is science fiction turning into science fact, because this looks like those toys that I had when I was a kid in the 50s. Well, his vision and others are still saying, hey, think about it. Our population is expanding. We'll be at 10 billion in, I don't know, a couple not too far distant future, and by 2050, we're going to be way up there. We're going to run out of room at some point. We're already facing it. Can you imagine when you left LA because traffic sucked, and now you're in Rancho Mirage, and then when traffic sucks, where are you going to go next? So where are you going to go? This is Elon Musk's, and this is one of his briefings, and he's like, hey, we got to be multiplanetary species, What if we get hit by an asteroid and it takes us out like the dinosaurs got taken out, however many hundreds of millions of years ago? And so the briefing that he has is very technically sophisticated. It actually, he really is paying attention to the physics. You can't break laws of physics. And so here's one of his artist renditions of, the first vehicle gets there, and then the second one, you build landing strips, you connect them up, and then you expand the habitats. There are resources on Mars that can be exploited. And that's his goal, is to take as much of that as possible so that we could actually have a no-kidding, multiplanetary species as a survival imperative. Think about what it must have been like hundreds and hundreds of years ago when ships were sailing and taking people to other distant shores, and the technology was, not always reliable, and once you got somewhere, you had to face this austere thing. Or think about the railroads in the 1800s when they first built them, in the UK. The people would say, some of the scientists would say, well, man cannot go faster than a horse or he will die. And there were people actually saying, hey, you can't do this. And then high-speed trains developed, and now these trains are going 200 kilometers an hour. I mean, in Germany and Europe, they're unbelievably fast. The bullet train in Japan. This is the new deal. This is what those dreamers in the 1800s who were saying, hey, we're gonna build railroads and expand to unknown territories with that. So this is the future, no doubt. Will it be in my lifetime? Well, not unless I cryogenically freeze myself and then get reborn at some later stage. But I'd like to think that one of our students or one of our kids or one of our friends' kids is the first to step foot on Mars or lives up there at some point. What a great, and just imagine that zip code. That's what our future holds, and that's what I hope to take, this message to you all and share some thoughts on it. And I love this quote. This was a Russian self-trained mathematician, a teacher in the Tsarist Russia, and he actually developed the math that identified that if you were in space, you would be weightless. His name is Konstantin Tsiolkovsky. He was deaf. He had a lot of things to overcome, not the least of which was the really forbidding climate he was in. But he came up with this quote, which I think is absolutely phenomenal. The Earth is the cradle of mankind. but one cannot live in the cradle forever. Thank you.